Hello, and welcome back to Parley, a show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice in a kind of custom mini podcast that other people can watch too. This month, Vampir has chosen a discussion about the old buildcraft shuffle. This is kind of a staple buildcraft experience in my mind, where you've got a bunch of, characters, whatever the game's equivalent of that is, and then a bunch of things you could equip to them, weapons, gear, or whatever. And you only have so many of each, you can't just put the same thing on everyone. Sometimes you can, in these games you can't. And you have to kind of shuffle them around to get the most out of each thing. So we're going to be doing that today. Vampir says, we're doing a buildcraft puzzle to help me with my Genshin Impact conundrum. I recently leveled Sinyan, pictured here, on my Genshin Impact account, and I'm being forced to put the fish claymore on her. Do you want to, or are you being held at gunpoint to? What do you mean by forced? Anyway, I request a Zandy branded think piece on what makes a weapon a stable, permanent fit for a character. And here you can see Vampir's account, and Sinyan uses a claymore, and here they have all the claymores they own on their account, and all the claymore characters on their account, and what each of them is currently using. And of course, I'm familiar enough with Genshin Impact that I know what all of these are off the top of my head. Posted under this parlay, Vampir explains, is a picture of my current claymore collection and roster. How would you shuffle it around so that Sinyan is holding the fish while everyone else is on a weapon which provides at least 2 goodness points for their kits? Okay, so again, what we're going to be doing in this parlay is moving around these weapons, or maybe not, but, considering moving them around. And we're required to give Sinyan the fish. She has to end up with the fish. But everybody else, we're just trying to get the most overall value, basically. And so Vampir says, I'll now outline my proposed points system. 1 goodness point is awarded if, for example, the weapon has high base attack, the character gets a lot of attack percent, because that will multiply well. The weapon has low base attack, and the character doesn't care about attack. Okay, we'll come back to my critique of these points later, but alright. The weapon has a damaging effect. It does damage, the character innately has or builds physical damage, because that will boost it. The weapon has a substat, or gives a meaningful amount of a stat, which directly increases their damage output. Okay, yeah, the weapon has relevant stats. And the weapon provides some niche interaction, like the Forest Regalia here. This allows team buffing through Dender reactions, or the Sacrificial Greatsword would allow Chungyun to shred cryo resistance with the expiration hit of his skill, because you can only have 1 instance out at a time. Basically something specific to a character. Sure. Vampir concludes, I feel the fish hits 3 goodness points on Sinyan, as its attack percent combined with her Ascension stat attack percent can allow me to run defense on her somewhere. It also has burst percentage and does the physical synergy thing. The problem is that it has the same effect with the attack percent on Chungyun and allows him to run Elemental Mastery in his build, which I value. Yes, a complicated parlay that will be difficult to answer in the time we have, but I will do my best, and here's how I'm going to tackle it. I want to talk about this points thing first, and then I'm going to, solve the puzzle the way I would. I wouldn't change too much. I don't think this one is extremely hard by my reasoning. And a lot of the stuff that you have on here, a lot of the considerations you're making sounds similar to ones that I've made. But then we're going to talk about the thing you asked at the beginning. You said you kind of want a Zandy branded think piece. Parlay on what makes a weapon a stable, permanent fit for a character. I think that's quite challenging, but I'll do my best. We're going to try to deal with those things each in turn so that none of them gets too much time. So first of all, this points thing. I like the idea of abstracting the synergy bits for a weapon choice, for an item in a game, for a character choice, into a point system. Now, personally, I feel like there's a lot of different ways you could view this sort of points thing. Remember that people don't always make builds for them to be good. It can just be it feels great to have something that's a good fit and you'll use its abilities, or it just has impact to see an additional hit of damage go off if a character does a big attack that does a bunch of hits of damage, or things like that. You like how the weapon looks with the character. I don't know, something like that. So goodness points don't have to be some objective philosophical thing. I'm mostly saying this for people other than Vampir. I don't think that these are united under the same philosophy. I think there's kind of an odd one out. but that's perfectly fine, if not expected. They should kind of be like the things you care about that make you enjoy a weapon as a fit on a character. I gotta say, it's challenging, I think, to put those to words, so that's really interesting to read that. Now, the one I was going to talk about was the weapon having low base attack and the character doesn't care about attack. This is a weird one, a topic we don't really have time for here, but it's relevant to this thing about points for a weapon or an item. That obviously isn't a positive thing, it's just the lack of a negative thing. But in Genshin Impact, at least, weapons generally have, more of their substat if they have lower base attack, at least relative to their rarity. So, for example, if Forest Regalia here has a lower tier of base attack for a 4-star Claymore, it's gonna have more of whatever its secondary stat is, energy recharge. Eyeballing it, it looks like this one is about in the middle. Just to give a few quick examples from the roster right here, if I recall, the Serpent Spine, which is on your Noelle, that's in the middle, so it gives a medium amount of its substat, and it has medium base attack for a 4-star weapon. Sacrificial Greatsword has a high base attack, so it has a lower amount of its substat, which is energy recharge. What I mean to say is that, all things being equal, if a weapon has low base attack but then high whatever else it gives for its rarity, in Genshin Impact, it's implied that you're getting good value. You're kind of avoiding the weaker part of the weapon and taking advantage of the stronger part. So I can get behind when you say a weapon has low base attack and the character doesn't care about attack. Reading between the lines, it's implied that that means the weapon will be very good at whatever else it provides. But in and of itself, that isn't a benefit, of course. If the weapon was otherwise superior for the character in your evaluation, but just also had high base attack, that would not be a negative, it would just be a non-positive. This is all fine, of course. I just think it's interesting to consider how, even though that is not itself necessarily like a thing that means the weapon is like actively good on that character, it might be something that just feels like a really good fit, which I can totally get behind. You might be less likely to use that weapon elsewhere, which we'll come back to in the sort of future-proofing, putting a weapon on a character permanently thing. If that weapon has a negative quality that this character avoids, it might be pretty safe to invest in it for them. And of course, third, it does imply in a game that is balanced in such a way that the weapon will be good for the character for some other reason because they're avoiding one of its negative aspects. Sure. I just thought it was interesting to focus on that one. Now, it would take a very long time to go through each character and say, I'm giving them one goodness point for this and one goodness point for this and whatever. So as I talk about them, I'm not going to actually say those things, but I'm going to try in my description to explain what I think those goodness points are. So you should be able to vaguely count, how many each character is getting. And I am going to kind of use the examples you gave. You did say they were examples to sort of abstract. It might not be something in that list, but basically you mean the weapon has a facet of its effects that is synergistic with the character. One thing I think this is doing very well is demonstrating is a very effective example. Like, I know exactly what you mean without more, instances of this. So that's how I'm going to tackle doing this. Now, of course, we have to go over here. This is going to be a little challenging because we need to be able to see the weapons. Sinyan, do we need to see you? And we don't. I'm sorry. I love you, but should have played more rock instruments. We're going to put that there so that we have the available weapons and who they're on. I meant to center vertically. Available. The idea here being that, this will be a hard part to follow if you don't play Genshin Impact. I'm always very interested in covering these games in a way that talks about them as games where you make builds, kind of related to other games like that. You might find this interesting, this part of this Parley interesting, just as a bit of sort of game tourism. What is this process, which happens in lots of games where you'd make builds? What is it like in Genshin Impact? Like, what is it like hearing about these individual builds? You might enjoy that. You might not enjoy it because you feel lost. It's too abstract. Even people that play Genshin Impact might find this too abstract, but there's nothing I can do in the format of a Parley. I don't think it's bad for some Parley to be much more specific. Once there's more Parley in the future, there's a lot of these coming out. It's okay if some of them are not extremely broad in their appeal. Some people have kind of focused on that a lot. Other people have embraced it as like, this is a podcast for me that other people could listen to. This to me feels like kind of the latter, which if you don't mind me saying, I feel like it'd be reasonable for more of those to exist. So anyway, just as a disclaimer, I think this will be challenging to follow. I've tried to make it as digestible as possible, given the format we have to work with, for people that do know what these things are, or that are interested in hearing, what this process might be like. Okay? So again, I'm not going to actually say the goodness points. I'm just going to try to even out the value on these weapons. I think hitting 2 of these for each character, it should be pretty easy. So I'm not too worried about, accomplishing the stated goal. It's just a matter of explaining why and, well, which ones. Let's get a few out of the way. I'm going to leave Noelle and Dory with what they have. So Noelle is using Serpent Spine. This weapon has a medium base attack. Noelle is going to buff her attack by a lot using her burst, converting her defense into a big attack buff. So, some base attack, that's very good. And it gives crit chance. Always nice to have crit chance, because Genshin Impact usually only provides you with 1 slot for a crit stat, crit chance, or crit damage. On the main stat of your artifact, only your crown artifact can get it of the 5 as a main stat. It's very nice to have another big source of crit somewhere else, the character's ascension stat or on your weapon, but pretty much the only places. Maybe some artifact sets. So having a weapon that has crit stats on it is almost automatically good for a character that will be doing damage, which is pretty much all of them. So that's fantastic. And Serpent Spine has this effect that accumulates a lot of damage, but if you take damage, even the tiniest bit of damage, you lose stacks of it very quickly. Now, Noelle can provide a very powerful shield for herself while attacking, so she is not very vulnerable to losing the stacks, and she has a very, very lopsided, gigantic attack buff, so it would be very desirable to get a big damage percent buff, which Serpent Spine gives, to match with that. She gets a lot of damage out of it, and she kind of negates its drawback. Personally, I think it looks kind of nice with her, too. Anyway, I build my Noelle defense, geo damage, and critical, probably, damage, and I'm using Retracing Bolide. Gives her some more damage while shielded, which I won't be attacking with her if she isn't, and it makes her shield stronger, which helps not turn off this weapon. Cool. Dory. I would leave Dory as well. I don't use the bell on her, but this is the kind of HP focused decent weapon that you have at the moment. I think it's a reasonable choice. Looks cool on her, I think. I would leave Dory as is. I use Thundering Fury on her to make her cooldown on her skill a little bit shorter, and also for another strategy we've talked about on stream. But anyway, I think it's good even if you don't do that. And right now, I'm using attack, electro damage, and crit. I've found her healing to be adequate even with no built HP. I feel like she still heals for a pretty good amount so far. Your mileage may vary. This gives some HP percent, so it definitely will make her heal for more. And I think that the damage percent from when you activate the shield on the bell, that's quite valuable. Dory does do damage from a few different sources. If you have her second constellation effect, she fires out those little electro boop things. Those don't really count as any particular source of damage, so they can be hard to increase. Electro damage increases, and things that increase all your damage would increase them. And so the bell's shield giving you a damage boost for everything while it's active, this seems kind of good on Dory, sure. Right. Okay, so those two I would leave pretty much as is. And I think the weapons they have clearly easily achieve multiple goodness points. On Noelle, I think Serpent Spine is it's a masterpiece. Okay, so from here, there's a couple different ways you could sort of approach the puzzle. You could go from like easiest sell to hardest sell. So, for example, for Noelle, I would not be willing to use Serpent Spine on any other characters on this account. So that one's easy. Like, I'm not even considering it for anybody else. That's just me to some extent. I don't think it's bad on Beidou, by the way. But I'm not going to. And so that makes it pretty easy to kind of cut that one out of the running. Likewise, Dory, I suspect you're quite interested in her having an HP percent weapon. And the bell is, in my opinion, not very good on any other character on this account, except barring some jank. So again, you can kind of quickly cut that out. We could keep going that way. Again, we could go for the characters where I think there's a weapon that it's a great fit on them in a way that surpasses all the other options to kind of cull the field, make it so we're moving between less weapons. There are other approaches, but that's what I'm going to do. So the next not most obvious, but like the nicest fit, I guess, right? For me is Razor with Rain Slasher. This is that green sword that Dillik currently has. Razor has this thing with his burst where he gets an attack speed buff. He still does physical damage on his hits, but he does little electro damage as well from his wolf spirit doing the claw attacks with him. And this makes Razor a little odd to boost the damage of because not all of the damage is physical or electro. You do get more physical damage when attacking with him, but there's a meaningful amount of electro damage there, and his skill does a lot of electro damage. So I often want to boost both, but you can't straightforwardly. Razor does get physical damage as an ascension stat as well, if I remember correctly. Rain Slasher gives a damage boost, everything, as long as the enemy has electro or hydro. So Razor should quite easily achieve that condition, and then it boosts all of his damage, all sources, physical or electro, which I think is unusually strong on him. That's an effect that would be difficult to replicate. And the Elemental Mastery is also quite welcome because he will trigger electro very, very frequently. So I feel like Rain Slasher is an unusually good weapon on him. Something I didn't get into as much, but I'll briefly touch on later with the points thing, is that I think that Rain Slasher effect is in context actually worth more than 1 point on Razor. I feel like that's so good for increasing his damage as a normal attacker. It's not fair to give it, it's definitely 1 point. I feel like it should be more than that. Even if you consider it to be worth some points on other characters, I feel like it's worth more for him. So that's something. And the Elemental Mastery is relevant. You should check out those teams. We played with these on a live stream recently, where it's Razor and then you bring a bunch of other elements, often Hydro, Pyro, and Dendro, to make a kind of rainbow reaction team. Those have been pretty fun. They're awkward to play for me so far, but they've been pretty spicy. Definitely worth a try, although I suspect you already know about them. Elemental Mastery is really good for that. So to me, Rain Slasher on Razor makes a lot of sense. It's also a very elegant pair with Thunder Soother artifacts. This is basically an artifact set that does the same thing as Rain Slasher. It gives you a damage bonus for everything if the enemy has Electro on them. I use attack crit on my Razor with Thunder Soother. I use attack crit instead of attack electro damage crit or something, because attack boosts all of his damage. Electro damage would only boost, well, his electro damage, and if you're going to attack with him a lot, I think that the benefit of getting more attack is higher, but I'm just eyeballing it. You also have a lot of damage percent already, right? Physical damage from his Ascension stat, and then 2 big chunks of damage from Thunder Soother and the Rain Slasher. So I build attack crit with Thunder Soother on him, and I think you should use Rain Slasher there. Dillik currently doesn't have a weapon. We could tackle him next, but I think we're going to leave him floating for a second. We're going to go to Beidou and Sayu. I see you both have them with like energy recharge focused claymores, which I think makes a lot of sense too. They both have expensive bursts that are most of what they accomplish. Like a lot of their sort of team supporting utility and damage comes from these big chunky burst effects. Sayu's roll can do a lot of damage, but that burst can be a little challenging to charge. So I like that. You kind of have 3, I would think of it as, energy recharging claymores, straightforwardly. The Sacrificial Greatsword that Beidou currently has, the Nagamasa, the craftable one from Inazuma. This one gives you kind of energy regeneration when you hit with your skill, but you lose a little energy temporarily, and it makes your skill damage higher. And then Favonius Sword, Greatsword, which is what your Sayu has. This just gives you more particles when you crit. Personally, I use the Favonius Greatsword on Beidou, and I use the Nagamasa on Sayu. Sayu first. Sayu's roll, her skill, does a lot of damage, and it's not the fastest ability to end. So when you use it with the Nagamasa, you get a hit, and then Sayu is quite slow coming out of it. Usually, if this drains your energy, and then you can't use your burst right away, you'll have gotten that energy back already in time before you're done rolling. So I don't think that the weapon's only drawback, if you can even call it that, is very significant on Sayu, and it's a very effective way to get a lot more energy. I also care about boosting the damage of her skill. It's a good skill. It does good damage. So I like the Nagamasa on her a lot. It looks cool. And Beidou. I like the Favonius Greatsword. It doesn't really make that much sense on paper. So it gives you particles when you crit. Now, a lot of these weapons in Genshin Impact, they can't trigger those effects when the character's not on the field. Beidou, it's worked very well for me, and I think it's just because all of her hits are area of effect hits. So it's quite easy to get a crit to trigger somewhere. But really all I'm doing with her is swapping her in to do her skill, her burst, and then swapping her off. You wouldn't think that would reliably give you all the particles, but for me, it just has been very reliable. I don't know. This is a place where I feel like that it does come down to synergy with one's playstyle a little bit. It has definitely been effective for me, and I don't want to use that weapon somewhere else. So, like, I'm not going to take it off, but why? Like, why is it so effective? If you think about it in another way, the low base attack on Favonius Greatsword seems kind of bad for Beidou. She would love to scale that damage higher. Having low base attack doesn't seem good. So I get why you used the Sacrificial Greatsword on her. I don't think the cooldown reduction effect is very useful on her, personally. I feel like getting the counter twice in a row, because it doesn't do very good damage unless you actually do a counter. I don't think it's a very valuable ability to get off cooldown like that. But there's a way in which you could say it's kind of winning by default a little bit. I don't know. I mean, I like Favonius Greatsword on Beidou, but I don't have an easy way to defend that. Furthermore, I build energy recharge, electro damage, and crit on Beidou. You'll notice I have no attack, and her weapon has low base attack. That seems pretty bad. I'm using Emblem of Severed Fate. But that is just what's happened to fit for me. Like, I have other suggestions for weapons in the abstract that your account does not have. But yeah, I bring this up just as an example of a place where it may be reasonable to look at your account and say, I don't think any of these are particularly amazing fits for this character. So I'm kind of willing to have them be using something less effective. Beidou's still going to be very useful. But I don't think that's a particularly effective selection of weapons for her. Or you could then backtrack. Now, I'm not sure we can get into this and still keep this parlay at a reasonable length, but the weapon that I think most resolves the conflict with Beidou might be Rain Slasher that we just gave to Razor. So here's where I think it matters that you can give multiple points. Like, I think Razor is getting a lot more out of it than Beidou is, but in the context of your account, there are other weapons I would be perfectly willing to use on Razor. I just think they're vastly inferior. The one he's using, Prototype Archaic, or Star Silver, what Sinyan currently has. Good, reasonable weapon choices on him. I do think they're far inferior to Rain Slasher on him, but I think everything else on this account is also far inferior to Rain Slasher on Beidou. So, I would put Favonius Greatsword on her. I think that the high energy recharge percentage and the particle generation are desirable on her, and Emblem of Severed Fate is also very effective on Beidou, in my opinion. And you could say that is 2 goodness points, which is what you said you wanted. I'm not meaning to be critical to you specifically, Vampir. I just hope this is an interesting point in the discussion to consider, but that it's kind of bad. Anyway, so that's what I would do. Moving along, this leaves Diluc, Chang'en, and Sinyan. We've done rather well. It certainly narrowed the field quite a bit, that Beidou awkwardness notwithstanding. She does technically have 2 goodness points coming out of it. So what to do? Well, you said that Sinyan must have the fish. So there you go. She has the fish. The fish gives you a burst damage increase, and when you do your burst, you get a hit of physical damage. That's nice with Sinyan. Her burst is almost all of her significant damage. She gets a physical damage increase from some of her talents and would desire it because her burst does physical damage, and the fish generated by the fish's effect does physical damage. So she'll magnify that. It's an elegant fit, sure. This leaves Chang'en and Diluc. Diluc, I think, is maybe the easier of the two. I would be willing to use the Star Silver, the Archaic, Sacrificial Greatsword on him. Sacrificial Greatsword will reset the cooldown of his skill if any of the 3 hits trigger it. They reset the whole chain. Diluc's 3-hit combo on his skill is very, very good at using Sacrificial Greatsword's effect. in that you will almost certainly get 6 hits. It'll reset the chain, you'll get all 3 again. But that does leave him on the field a long time. Isn't he just going to be on the field a long time, though? You know. And as you get Dillick constellations, you're also encouraged to weave his skill and his normal attacks to an extent that you wouldn't want to use his skill 6 times necessarily. Maybe. So while it's not bad, it is a little awkward. And I do think that the Sacrificial Greatsword is probably Chongyun's only remaining reasonable choice here. I'll get into that more in a minute. So for Dillick, to solve this the puzzle with Dillick and Chongyun, I think it's simply that Dillick has more choices that score 2 points with him, making it an easy decision. We'll give Dillick something that's a little bit less particular, or that Chongyun isn't interested in, and then we have inconvenienced Chongyun as little as possible. I'm going to say Prototype Archaic. It's what Razor currently has on your account. It has high base attack. It gives a little bit of attack percent. Dillick is likely to get some attack percent from elsewhere. His constellations, once you eventually get them. Pyro Resonance, potentially, would give attack percent. And I just don't think you need to build more, necessarily, freeing you up to build what I build on Dillick. Elemental Mastery, Pyro Damage, and Crit. With, I'm using Crimson Witch of Flames on him, probably, obviously. So a great fit, definitely scores 2-3 points. The effect of the Archaic is that you get a spike of damage as a chance on hit. It's physical damage, but it is a big spike of damage, and Dillick does fairly even damage. He's not very bursty. He does very steady damage. I actually think it's kind of nice to have a big chunky hit every so often on Dillick, so it scores some points there as well in my book. Leaving Chongyun, and I think that makes it make the most sense to use the Sacrificial Greatsword. It has high base attack, so we can scale that attack bonus wherever he's getting it from. It's got a little bit of energy recharge. I don't think this is desirable on Chongyun, but his skill does have a long cooldown, so if he doesn't get enough particles, it's a bigger problem than characters that have a lower cooldown skill. A little bit of energy recharge is okay. It's good that it has high base attack, in my opinion. And then the effect is very nice. As you mentioned, Chongyun's skill deploys a field. You can only have one field at once. Normally doesn't matter because the cooldown is too long on his skill. If you use Sacrificial Greatsword, you get the cooldown back and you do this skill again. The first field immediately expires, and he's got an effect that does a follow-up hit of damage when the field expires that also makes enemies more vulnerable to cryo damage. So it's quite reliable. You get a pretty big increase in damage in practice when using it that way, even though on paper it doesn't seem that amazing. Like you would have gotten the damage anyway, but it might have missed, and getting it on demand is very nice. I also just think it's really fun. It just feels cool. It's a fun feeling. Now, the remaining piece of the puzzle is that you said you want to build Elemental Mastery on Chongyun. I feel like he will get an attack percent boost anyway. I would recommend using Noblesse on Chongyun. Burst damage, he's got a lot of that, and gives an attack buff to the team when he does his burst. I feel like that's some attack, and then I'm building attack cryo damage crit. But you said you want to build probably Elemental Mastery cryo damage crit. So I'm not sure what to say there. I feel like you will still get a little attack if you're willing to build Noblesse, but you might not want to. That's hard. In my mind, that's a couple of points, but of course there's a level on which, like, this is impossible to answer in a parlay if I had to know every single build for every character on your account. So that's how I would solve it. I also, personally, I don't run Elemental Mastery on Chongyun, even though I like it on him, because when I'm going to react with his burst, he does a bunch of hits of cryo all in a row. It's kind of like a big combo that does a ton of cryo hits, rather than a bunch spread out. So usually I'm okay with the Elemental Mastery coming from somewhere else when Chongyun will be doing reactions. He is going to need a partner that can inflict a lot of, let's say, pyro, like Bennett, for example. And my Bennett does have instructors, which gives Elemental Mastery to the team. This means that I'm not worried about Chongyun having the Elemental Mastery. Even though I want him to have some, he's always going to end up in a team where there is some being thrown around, so I don't consider it as valuable on his kit when I care about his reactions. But that's a fairly personal thing. Like, that is a build philosophy thing. I think it works very elegantly, but there's really no right or wrong or rhyme or reason. That's just what I do. I don't like the Star Silver on Chongyun. It gives physical damage. Not planning to attack with him that much, and his skill makes his own attacks cryo damage instead of physical. It does trigger an icicle, which does more damage when it explodes in an area if the enemy has cryo, which he can inflict on them. That seems like a synergy, but I don't want to normal attack with Chongyun. I feel like the damage that gives, I lost that damage by keeping him on the field longer, you know? But I don't think it's a bad choice. Does it have 2 goodness points? Like, no, maybe 1, you know? If I recall, Star Silver also has low or not high base attack. I might be wrong about that. Anyway, not ideal, in my opinion. So that's what I would do. Now, all of that aside, I do also think that Sacrificial Greatsword is good on Xinyan. I feel like resetting her shield if you swap back to her to use it again is nice. It's got a long cooldown. I don't know if you need a 3rd shield, her burst, her skill, and then her skill again. But I don't think that's a bad choice either. Nevertheless, if this was my account, that's what I would do. I would leave Noelle and Dori with what they have. I'd basically just swap Dillik and Razor. I would give Sayu the Nagamasa and Beidou the Favonius Greatsword. I would give Xinyan the Fish, and I'd give Chongyun Sacrificial Greatsword. I think I've also talked myself back into putting Sacrificial Greatsword on my own Chongyun after this video. I was using it for a bit, I took it off. I want it back on. Okay, so that's the puzzle done. Now, I do want to get more, after discussing that a bit, into some closing points about the idea of kind of permanent weapons on a character, or like long-term items on builds in ongoing games. I feel like this question is a lot about what do we even do about making builds in games that are a moving target, because investing in weapons stops meaning anything outside of that moment's context to some extent. You're basically reviewing the game for its buildcraft options, but the game is never done. So you sort of can't know that that decision is good. You know, you have to make it for some limited time. I have always been excited about the idea of trying to intuit whether something is good, kind of in theory, not just in practice, not just at the moment. And obviously there's a balance to be had. Most people really bounce off the idea of trying to predict when a thing will be good, if it's not practical right now. I think not doing that at all clearly doesn't make any sense, but I usually do it to a degree that people don't like. I'm future-proofing for infinity, sort of for all time, in a way that people don't always enjoy, which I understand. I think the tricky part is there's a balance. Not to think at all ahead is pretty silly if you've played these games for any amount of time. That's to be ignorant of the fact that they just do change very frequently. You're walking into disappointment, and yet to say that you should always be thinking when you make a build decision to invest in anything, in any ongoing game, that you need to think about what's going to happen to it in the future. I mean, let's talk about Warframe briefly. Who knows? Like, I don't know. Who knows? Who knows? In Genshin Impact, I think another good example, bringing this back for the sec, is how the Dendro weapons, the weapons that you get from crafting in Sumeru, well, these trigger some effect. This one pictured here, Forest Regalia, and there's a whole cycle of them. They trigger some effect when you do a Dendro elemental reaction. You can use them on other elements of character, but a lot of people, certainly me included, well, we're going to use them only on Dendro characters to reliably get a supportive effect. I think they're good weapons, broadly, too. Not amazing, but pretty okay. But like, which ones, though? But which of them? Because at the moment, we only have a few varieties of Dendro character. We only have bow and technically a sword Dendro character, the Traveler. So what about the other Dendro weapons? You know, you could just wait to craft them. But how long before that resource is then useful for something else and you're just not sure what to do, you know? That may not happen, but we don't know, you know? I think it's reasonable to look at the amount of resources you have. And, you know, if I have the materials and more, I'm comfortable making one of each weapon and then just waiting and seeing. If anything new comes out, I can craft it, etc. But the problem comes when you have limited resources. You're not sure whether you're going to make use of this thing, but you need to make there's a fork in the road about how to use that resource now, and you're just not sure. How to pick a character that you want to focus on in Genshin Impact, or in Warframe, it might be leveling certain mods. For example, like you have a lot, but not a ton of endo. You can level one mod a lot, but not completely. You wouldn't be able to level two mods a lot, but not completely. You have to kind of pick. And to say, oh, we'll just even it out. Yeah, okay, but there are some times when you need a certain threshold, like a lot of strength in Warframe. This happens a lot. You need a set amount of strength, so you don't really want the mod unless it's leveled up a lot. You really do need to kind of commit the resources a little bit. Again, examples aside, if you've played any ongoing games with meaningful build choices, you know this happens plenty of. It's very frequent. Like this whole the puzzle where you shuffle resources around thing, and the act of investing in those resources. This is a very common experience when you're making builds in ongoing games. Again, my short answer, like what do you do, is I think people don't try hard enough to predict the future, and I try too hard. So do something in between what you're currently doing and what I do, but not what I do and not what you're currently doing. Maybe that doesn't apply to everybody watching this, but that would be my short answer. I think that trying to think about in the abstract what the weapon or the mod or the character or the warframe or whatever represents in the game as a whole, rather than just what they seem useful for to you at the moment, is kind of the defining characteristic of somebody who makes builds a lot. They're going to be interested in things for what they kind of represent a little bit, not just for what they are right now. That being said, obviously this is a bit difficult. And there are games, I think Warframe is a beautiful example, where the game is too unpredictable for that to be practical on any level, any meaningful level. Genshin Impact, by contrast, I think is a game where we have enough ability to, know what's coming. The game doesn't go in these insane directions. We just get, unexpected things here and there, where it's definitely not going to get you burned a lot of the time to make the effort to predict ahead a little bit. Looking a few patches ahead at what characters are coming out, thinking about what this sort of miniature, your own context metagame for a certain kind of weapon is. You're not sure where the polearm will be useful of that dendro craftable weapon set, but you have very limited polearms. So in theory, if a polearm character did come out, which will happen eventually, you will be happy to have more polearms to pick from. Like you kind of know that now. And so you could, I don't know who I'm talking to. I guess I'm talking to myself. Sure. That is true of me at the moment. So that's kind of what I mean. That's hard to give practical examples of. This topic of what to do about ongoing games and making kind of stable, permanent-ish fits for characters is very interesting to me. Personally, I think this goodness points thing, my critique about how I think you should be willing to award more than 1 point for a thing aside, is really useful, because sometimes you see an amount of goodness points that is unusual for that type of item appear, or the item has a characteristic that you'd be hard pressed to get a benefit from, but this character does get that benefit. And so if it's a good fit, yeah, maybe just go with it. A really good example is actually my Sinyan on my Genshin Impact account. I bought Blackcliff Claymore from the shop. This weapon gives crit damage, it's got a good base attack, and it has an effect where if you get the killing blow on enemies, you get an attack buff for a little while. This is not that reliable. Some types of fights that are going to be really hard, you won't kill any enemies during the fight before it's over. There's like one boss, and so you're not going to trigger, you can't ever trigger the effect during those fights. So that's negligible. And the character also has to reliably be getting the last hit without you micromanaging to get a small attack buff, which is all it is, a small attack buff. Now, Sinyan does do a really big burst of damage when she does her elemental burst. It's one single big hit. So I do think it's more likely than usual that she will last hit things. It doesn't take that much effort to trigger that a few times in fights where it applies. Additionally, I want the crit damage anyway, a lot more than I do normally. Sinyan has that constellation that makes her burst automatically crit So you don't need to build crit chance at all. It'll always crit. I don't think any of her other damage is significant. So I'm just dumping crit chance. We build crit damage on the crown and crit damage on the weapon. And that gives her a really robust damage increase when she doesn't provide that much other damage. Like, I really want that burst to hit for meaningful damage. I also have Tenacity of the Millilith as an artifact set. That's a little attack. I'll often get a little attack from my Blackcliff Claymore, and she has attack as an ascension stat, you said. My memory doesn't, you're probably right. And finally, she's a pyro unit. She might end up with an attack, but attack buffs are not that uncommon anyway. Between all of that, that's enough attack. She does pretty good damage, even though I have her built defense, physical damage, crit damage. And Tenacity of the Millilith gives her that shield strength for the team as well. So very strong shields while losing almost nothing in terms of damage. It just fits really well, and I don't see myself wanting Blackcliff Claymore anywhere else. I had to invest to make that choice. You have to go buy one. You can't roll them. You have to purchase it from the shop using that resource you get from wishing for stuff. So I had to choose to allocate that resource there and not know what claymores would exist in the future. Maybe this will feel like a waste in the future, but it's been over a year, and I don't think that that resource has been wasted. I feel like that was a good choice, broadly speaking, because I sort of looked at the number of, and the way that the goodness points were being scored, and just how few other characters were scoring goodness points with that weapon, if you will, and it just seemed like the weapon was fairly future-proof. And I think that was true, by and large. It's not the only good choice, but yeah, reasonable. I think you're right that the fish is an unexpected weapon that is probably the only other thing I think is like a very clean fit on Xinyan. Not the only other good weapon, but the only other thing I'm considering. Yeah, so I hope that's a good practical example. I do think that's challenging, but again, I think the litmus test is to break down not necessarily the goodness points on the thing, but the difference between the amount of goodness points the character gets from that thing and everybody else would get from that thing. And if there's a huge gap, it's pretty likely that this weapon will not remain the best choice in your estimation for that character for all time. But when you do this puzzle again in the future, you will end up getting the most overall benefit from leaving that weapon you picked on the character it's on. In other words, Xinyan might eventually have a weapon come along that I think is stronger on her on its own. But how likely is it that that weapon won't also be a really good fit on any other existing Claymore character? That's quite low, which means the odds are very high that even if I end up in that situation, investing in the thing specifically for her will still give my account overall value, because it doesn't actually matter whether it's the best weapon for her in whatever version of best I define for myself. It just matters that it helps the account overall gain total goodness points, I guess. Does that help? Is that a satisfying answer? I thought that's a satisfying answer. As I said, though, I do think this is a topic that is quite big. There's quite a few other directions you could go in. Again, I didn't really get as much into like implied power. Like, I was critiquing that goodness point thing about low base attack and the character doesn't care about attack. In Genshin Impact, that implies that the weapon will be beneficial in some way, but doesn't itself actually confer a benefit. But that also kind of might not matter. Like, that fact itself might be what is satisfying to a player, which that's more than fine. I think that's normal. We all like things that feel elegant to some extent. And I do also think there's a lot of value in just the practicality of gameplay. Again, I said Beidou using Favonius Greatsword. Not a very good solution to the puzzle the way you wrote it. It might technically fit, but it's not great. And yet my experience has been very good when I've used it. I'm not sure what to tell you. And I do think that bears further discussion as well. That's like 2 other parlays, but I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks very much. Looking forward to the next one.